Hi there. So today I want to present our systematic review titled Self-Referential Processing Effects of Non-Invasive Brain Stimulation. And this study is currently published in Frontiers of Neuroscience. So self-referential processing, or as we refer to normally as our sense of self, or SRP, actually has two subcategories: the semantic versus the somatic self. Now, the semantic self is what we colloquially refer to our sense of self. We also call that the verbal SRP or VSRP because it essentially refers to our characters. And we can engage in verbal SRP by asking ourselves the question, who am I as a person? Now, the lesser known parts of the self is the somatic self. We also call that nonverbal SRP or NVSRP for short. This is really about how we feel in our body at the current moment. So for example, if we ask ourselves, how do I feel right now in my body? We're effectively engaging in nonverbal SRP. Now, in addition to the scientific interest of SRP, there's also clinical implications of studying SRP. So here I'm going to briefly list some of the disorders that are associated with SRP. So on the verbal side, we have anxiety and mood disorders and dementia. On the nonverbal side, we have asomatonausea, and SRP in general have been found to be associated with suicide ideation, post-traumatic stress disorder, eating disorders, and Parkinson's disease. Now, given the importance of SRP, there has been a great deal of evidence from the fMRI literature on the neurocorrelates underlying SRP. However, we've only found one study that actually investigated the difference or directly contrasted verbal SRP versus nonverbal SRP. So in this study, they found that compared to nonverbal SRP, verbal SRP is associated with cortical midline structures within the default mode network, such as the medial prefrontal cortex and the posterior cingulate cortex. Whereas compared to nonverbal SRP is associated with areas of the brain like the insula, the inferior parietal lobule, and the extrahead body area. So where to go from here? We all know that fMRI research is not causal, and we also wanted to develop some sort of intervention for the disorders that I've mentioned previously. And this is where non-invasive brain stimulation comes in. Not only is it able to address the correlational but not causal problem, it can also potentially be used as an intervention for the disorders we mentioned earlier. Now, there are two common methods of non-invasive brain stimulation, or NIBS. They are transcranial magnetic stimulation, or TMS, and transcranial direct current stimulation, or TDCS. Now, both of these methods affect neuroexcitability. The difference being that TMS is harder to use, but it can reach subcortical regions. Now, the harder to use aspect refers to the fact that clients have to come to the hospital to receive TMS, and it needs to be operated by a skilled technician. Whereas TDCS, on the other hand, is easy to use. You can essentially train a student to use them, but it can only modulate the cortex. So this brings us to the research question. Does past evidence suggest that non-invasive brain stimulation, specifically TMS and TDCS, may differentially affect verbal SRP and nonverbal SRP? Now, to investigate this, we have looked into the PsycInfo and PubMed database and have found around 600 results. Now, we excluded studies that only investigated spontaneous SRP, and we've also excluded studies that did not have a task that's related to the sense of self. So, therefore, we ended up with 27 studies included in this review. Now, in terms of state of evidence here, out of the 27 studies, 10 were verbal SRP studies and 17 were nonverbal studies. So for the verbal SRP studies, the commonly used task is what's called self-referential encoding task. During this task, participants are asked to assign adjective to the self or a non-self other or object. And essentially, they're biased towards the self is referred to as the self-processing effect, as we're going to see later. So affective SRET here refers to the fact that these adjectives are emotional in nature, and neutral SRT refers to the fact that these adjectives were neutral. Now, on the nonverbal side, for this presentation, we're going to focus on the SODT, or the self-other discrimination task, where participants are asked to discriminate the faces of themselves versus the faces of others. Also, the heartbeat detection task, or HBDT, where they were simply asked to count their heartbeat or respiration. For the rubber hand illusion, RHI, this is quite complex on its own, so feel free to ask me a question after the presentation, but due to the time restraints, we're not going to get into that for this presentation. So, getting into the specifics, for emotional SRET, so this is the verbal SRP side, we have found that modulation to the medial prefrontal cortex and the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex have reduced self-criticism, so this is the negative emotional valence associated with SRET, whereas modulations to the IPL, or the inferior parietal lobule, did not really do anything. And interestingly, we have this one study found that modulation to the precuneus have also reduced self-criticism, but only compared to the supplementary motor area stimulation. So we have to interpret this result with a grain of salt. For neutral SRET, so these are the adjectives that are neutral in valence, we have actually found the opposite, where studies that stimulated the IPL found an effect, but studies that stimulated the MPFC didn't. So what does this generally mean? Well, integrating from the past MRI literature, we think that the left inferior parietal lobule is associated with determining self-relevance, whereas the medial prefrontal cortex is responsible for evaluating the effective value of these self-relevant stimuli. And then we have the posterior cingulate cortex, which is usually considered a general SRP driver, and this received some support from that one study that stimulated the precuneus. Now, for nonverbal SRP in self-other discrimination task, we found this right hemisphere lateralization in the brain stimulation literature. Specifically, studies that stimulated the right IPL have found that stimulation actually facilitated self-other discrimination, meaning that people actually got better at discriminating faces that are the self versus the other. Whereas one TDCS studies actually found that TDCS reduced self-other discrimination, meaning that the lines between the self faces and the other faces were blurred as the result of the stimulation. And one study has found stimulation to the DLTFC facilitated self-other discrimination as well. And none of these effects were found in the left hemisphere. Now moving on to interoception here. Well, I found that this one study that stimulated the bilateral insula reduced interoceptive accuracy, meaning that people count their heartbeat less accurately, whereas one TMS study that stimulated both the somatosensory cortex and the right insula also found reduced interoceptive accuracy. Now, taking that all together, we think that the right inferior parietal lobule, or the right IPL, is responsible for discriminating the self or the other, as shown in the brain stimulation studies, as well as past fMRI literature. Now, not surprisingly, stimulating the bilateral insula changed participants' interoceptive awareness, measured by their interoceptive accuracy, and their bodily self-consciousness, measured by self-reports of their sense of ownership. Now, as a conclusion, our literature review found that both verbal and nonverbal SRP can be differentially modulated by NIBS. However, the state of evidence is not very strong. As we saw in each category, there were not a lot of studies. And additionally, the study methods vary quite a bit. So within 27 studies, we have found 5 different experimental paradigms. Studies typically use a small sample size, and there is a prevalent lack of sham control. As future directions, we think it's advisable to add brain-based measurements such as EEG and fMRI on top of the NIBS to investigate the neurocorrelates as a result of the NIBS. And also, we encourage direct comparison between verbal and nonverbal SRP. In fact, this is something that we have been trying to do. So our progress so far is that we have developed a new SRP task allowing direct comparison between verbal and nonverbal SRP. Additionally, we have collected and analyzed EEG data from 48 students undergoing this verbal versus nonverbal SRP task. And we have got some preliminary results from a source localization method called eLoretta. And additionally, we have collected EEG data before and after TDCS for 19 students, and we have each student participating 5 sessions, so that was 95 one-hour sessions in total. So we're also trying to investigate the effect of NIBS measured by EEG. So that's what we have done so far as of end of October 2021, and thank you very much for listening. Here are the references.